Good morning, Pirates. Today we are going to talk about naming covalent compounds. If you remember from the last lecture, a covalent compound is formed from two or more nonmetals. However, there's not many nonmetals on the periodic table. So here's where the problem arises. There are two very common compounds that have carbon and oxygen bonded together, sharing their electrons. Carbon monoxide, this first one here. And if I just wrote it as carbon oxide, like you did with your ionic compounds, we changed the ending to the second, the nonmetal, you will see no one would know if you were talking about CO or CO2. So we need something called prefixes that we're going to be adding in front of the compound's name to signify how many atoms there are. So in carbon monoxide, there's only one oxygen, and in carbon dioxide, there's two oxygens. Okay? Carbon monoxide is the deadly gas you might have heard about that's emitted from our cars, and carbon dioxide is the healthy gas that we need to survive. Okay, so you definitely want to write down these prefixes up above. Okay, the prefix to symbolize one atom, you're going to put mono in front of the word. So monocarbon, mononitrogen. For two, you're going to put the prefix di. And you can start thinking of some common words with these. Monopoly, or to monopolize a discussion. Right now I'm monopolizing this lecture. I'm the only one talking. I'm one person. Okay, two, you could think of dividing something into two. The prefix for three, as you could probably guess, is tri, like triangle, has three sides. Four is an odd one. It's tetra. It's not quad. Okay, so I always think of, if you ever played the game Tetris, every piece in Tetris has four boxes to it. Four tetra. Five, as you probably guessed, is penta, like the pentagon, or a pentagon has five sides, a five-sided figure. A six-sided figure in geometry is called a hexagon. 7 is hepta. 8, octagon, or an octopus. 9 is nana. And 10 is deca, like a decade is 10 years. All right, feel free to pause it if you need to take more time to write those down. Okay, how's this going to work? The prefix goes in front of each element. To equal the subscript, or the number of atoms. Number of atoms of that element. So for example, in a compound C2Cl4, the first element we know is carbon, and since there are two carbon atoms here, we're going to go up to our prefixes, and the prefix for 2 is di. So in front of carbon, we put di, because a prefix goes in front. Then we look at our second element is Cl for chlorine, except to show that it's part of a bond or a compound, you're going to change the ending to IDE, just like you did with an ionic compound. And since there's 4 chlorine atoms, we go up here to 4, and we see the prefix is tetra. So the name of this compound would be dicarbon tetrachloride. There is one exception that we should write down for the prefixes. The only exception is when there's one atom of the first element listed. And there is only one atom of the first element we don't use the prefix mono. Just for the first one. So for example, if we have the compound CCl4, we know C is carbon, or you can look it up on the periodic table, and since there's no numbered after it, that is an invisible 1, so 1 carbon atom. And usually, if you look up here, the prefix for 1 is mono. However, since it's the first element, we're not going to write that. The second one, chlorine, which becomes chloride, and since there's 4 of them, we would still have that tetra prefix in front of it. So our final answer would be carbon tetrachloride. Because there's 1 carbon, we do not write the mono. Okay, let's try an example where I give you the name now and you try the formula. I think you will find this is so much easier than figuring out Roman numerals for ionic and figuring out charges when we don't know it. Okay? If I give you the compound dinitrogen monoxide, first thing to check to know that it's a covalent compound is look at the first element listed. It says nitrogen. So in case you're not familiar, you find nitrogen over here on the periodic table, and you remember that nitrogen's in the nonmetal side, element number 7 here, and oxygen. So 2 nonmetals are going to make a covalent compound. So nitrogen and monoxide or monoxide, oxygen is just capital O. Di, in case you forgot, like diagonal or divide, symbolizes 2 atoms. So after the nitrogen comes the 2, because this di tells me there's 2 nitrogens. And the mono tells me there's 1 oxygen, and we don't have to write this 1. Usually those 1s are emitted, and it's just N2O for your final answer. Couple things here to notice. There is no crisscross, like an ionic formula. If it says dinitrogen, that means there's 2 nitrogen atoms. We do not crisscross, and there's no charges because there's no transfer of electrons. The other thing to notice here, and it's not a big deal, and I will not grade you off for this, is the prefixes that end in a vowel, like mono, tetra, penta, hexa, almost all of them really. And when they're in front of an element like oxygen that has a starting vowel, you just don't write both O's. So it's monoxide, not monoxide. Just looks silly. You drop one of those O's.